A young man once stood up in the audience at a talk I gave, and incredibly bravely, in front of an audience the same size as this, he said he'd always felt like a failure, that when he looked in the mirror, all he could see was that he wasn't good enough. His question to me was, how does it feel to be a success? You know this isn't going to end well already. The thing was, the success he was referring to was somewhat unconventional to begin with. In 2004, I began walking from Trafalgar Square with a backpack. And 1 year later, I'd walked 5,000 kilometers all the way to the edge of the Sahara. I bought some camels and hired some nomads. And 2 years after that, I'd walked another 7,500 kilometers through the Sahara and, unfortunately, straight into a civil war in Niger, where my walk got cut prematurely short. I was headed for Cairo, but sadly I couldn't make it. So I came back to Australia, and pretty unhappy with that result, I wrote 2 books, Slow Journey South and Sahara, and they were published first here and now internationally. And then I began to speak to audiences about success and achievement and what those things look like. But there was one problem. I didn't feel successful at all. I didn't feel like I was enough. And so when that young boy stood up and so bravely asked his question, I had what can only euphemistically be termed a little moment that went for about the next 3 years. But what I discovered during that time altered forever the way I live and work. And what I'd like to speak with you about today is what I discovered during that entire process, the walk and what came afterwards, about our human needs and the way they shape our understanding of success, and about what is ultimately enough. Human need is something every one of you in this room understands already. You all know what it is to desire something, to feel an emptiness inside, to question whether you are good enough when you look in the mirror. And the interesting thing is, those needs are completely different for each and every one of us. If I asked every one of you in this room right now, what is it that you need the most? Love, peace, security, happiness. Every one of you would picture something completely different, even if you'd imagined the same word. And those differences, of course, are exactly what make us the unique individuals we are. But in them also lies the fundamental key to the way we perceive success, because it is those needs, those desires, which define what it is that we're drawn towards, what it is that we're driven to achieve. The next time that you're bored working from home, happens to me a lot, type in the words in Google, the fear of not being good enough. Clearly not that I've ever done this. When you do, the first entry that you'll see is this, atelophobia. Ateles is taken from the Greek to mean incomplete or imperfect, and phobia, of course, means fear. So we have the fear of being imperfect or the fear of being incomplete. And this is actually classified as an anxiety disorder. Now, underneath this phrase, there are some 23 symptoms that you can enjoy ticking yourself off against. Things like low self-esteem and the fear of failure, pessimism regarding upcoming activities. And around about now, you know exactly why it's never a good idea to self-diagnose using Google. When you come right to the bottom of this list of symptoms, there's one that says unhealthy emotions, such as anger, sadness, jealousy, and hurt. Unhealthy emotions. It certainly got my attention. None of us like to feel angry or sad or jealous or hurt. These are difficult and unpleasant emotions. but they're not unhealthy. I would argue that, in fact, they are the most healthy, powerful emotions we have, for they show us exactly where and how we feel incomplete or imperfect. And when we understand that emptiness, when we recognize it, we begin our search to find those missing pieces. Now, either consciously or unconsciously, we all hold in our head a mental image of what the end of that search is going to look like. These images, these perfect moments, if you will, in which we usually play a starring role, are powerful indeed. They're like the mythological pot of gold at the end of the search. And rationally, we know that these images are just a symbol. They're there to motivate us, to inspire us, to drive us on to achieve. But nonetheless, within them, there are powerful seeds, because these images form the very basis of the goals and aspirations that we use to create our own personal definition of success. Now, this conference, this wonderful global conference of TED and TEDx, is based on the understanding that each of us, as unique individuals, have wonderful ideas and gifts that are worth sharing. It would be fascinating to ask each speaker if what they delivered was what they originally went in search of. Because each of the ideas presented here represents somebody's search for their missing pieces. But so very often what we find is not what we set off looking for. And very often that's quite a good thing. In my case, definitely a very good thing, because my perfect moment looked a whole lot like Xena warrior princess kind of crossed with Lara Croft from Tomb Raider, with a bit of Indiana Jones thrown in there. You know, I had a thing about Diana the Huntress, you know, that mythological Roman goddess, striding off fearlessly into the unknown, completely invincible, weapon by her side, needing no one. All the psychologists in the audience are having a good laugh about now. And of course, when I got there, my perfect moment looked absolutely nothing like that. This is Mohammed, and at the time, he was my traveling companion. We'd been walking together for about 1,000 kilometers, about a month. And unfortunately, at the time, we had been walking through prickle country. So my fearless striding looked a whole lot more like very painful hobbling. I always love that photo, it gets such great reactions. And my delusion of being alone was somewhat destroyed by the fact that Mohammed was fairly much always just over the next sand dune, or otherwise he was on the other end trying to work out my digital camera, like in this shot. Nonetheless, when you walk through such magnificent country as that, and it was one of the most beautiful isolated pieces of the Sahara, you begin to fall into a kind of meditative trance. You become lulled into the rhythm of walking, and you slip into somewhere else, into a sort of stillness. And on this particular day, I was very much in that state. Been walking, been thinking, and suddenly, into that place of stillness, dropped a profound moment of clarity, of awareness. And it was simply this: you're just here. That's all. Now, I can't overemphasize the significance of those words to me at that time. What they meant, whilst they sound small now, was that I was enough, even though I'd feared so much that I wouldn't be. That everything was exactly as it needed to be, and that everything in the world, everybody in the world for that matter, was enough just as they were. And I knew in that moment how important that thought was. So important, in fact, it stopped me in my tracks, and I looked down at the rope in my hand, and I suddenly realized that there were supposed to be camels attached to that rope. And I turned around, and there, 200 meters behind me, fully laden with all of my worldly possessions, including all of our water, were my 3 camels, staring at me in the way that only camels can, like, going somewhere. So that night, I'm telling Mohammed about this around the campfire, and I said to him, you know, today I actually nearly lost the camels. And he's nodding away. And I said, no, really, I nearly did. I actually had this moment, it was like a spiritual revelation. I think that's the only way I can describe it. And Mohammed, you know, he's nodding away. He said, in the desert, it happens. The thing was, at the time, what I understood with absolute clarity was that I had found that pot of gold I was looking for, even though it looked nothing like what I'd gone in search of. I understood its importance, and I walked with it inside me, held like a treasure. And in the wonderful way the world works, not long after that, my walk came to a halt by civil war, and I flew back home to Australia. And in my first media interview, the journalist said to me, "What was it that you were most afraid of out there? And what's the greatest lesson that you learned?" And you need to know that I've had months to think about how I'm going to answer these questions. I could not wait to give her the benefit of my worldly wisdom at this juncture. I was pretty starved of conversation. So, bubbling over, I said to her, "Well, here's the thing. Before I went out there, I had this image of what I was going to look like, and pretty much I was just scared that I wasn't good enough to be that. And what I found when I was out there was that I am. I'm good enough, that we're all just here, and we're all good enough just as we are." She looked at me. I looked at her. I said, "This isn't really helping you, is it?" And she said, "No, not really." And I did something in that moment that affected the way my life ran for the next few years. I fished around in my memory bank, and I withdrew all of the events that had happened out there in the Sahara. And I began to tell her all of those events. I told her about getting held up and the time my camels got stolen and having to catch a camel, all these dramatic stories that make for a wonderful article. And she assiduously wrote every one of them down. And what I felt as I retold all of those events was every single one of those unhealthy emotions. I felt angry, I felt sad, but most of all, I felt deeply, deeply hurt. Because the reality was, those stories never mattered to me at all. They were just the weather. They were what happened out there. Perhaps they would have mattered to me when I was still obsessed with becoming Diana the Huntress, but she'd long since been revealed to me as no more than a myth. What mattered to me were the needs that had driven me out there, and those stories in no way told that emotional story. They in no way told the emotional journey I'd gone on every day from when I began walking. And they in no way at all expressed the incredible pot of gold that I had found. And every time in the years that followed that I stood on a stage and I talked about the walk and I recounted these situations and they were lauded as being an achievement or a success, what I felt was completely inauthentic. And so when that young man very bravely stood on a stage and said, "How does it feel to be successful?" I didn't know how to answer him. And I said simply, "I don't know. Success is a transient thing. It doesn't last. It doesn't even really exist." I exited the stage and I walked away, in fact, from everything, if you'll excuse the pun, to do with my walk for the next few years. And I went on a new search, this time to deconstruct success and to discover what it genuinely meant for me. And it wasn't all grim, I took a ticket and moved to Spain for a couple of years, ate a lot of really good food and danced flamenco, so all things work out in the end. But I learned a lot about success. And one of the first things I learned is pretty funny. The word success in its current definition only entered the dictionary in 1882. We've only had it around, meaning what it does, for the last century and a bit. And what it means, of course, in the Oxford Dictionary today is to achieve a desired outcome, which is fine if you're trying to get from A to B. Not so perfect if you're talking about the human being. The Oxford Dictionary doesn't have any problem, though. It says, when applied to a human being, that success means a person who attains wealth or fame. Where has a century of that definition brought us? What has it created? Well, we see it around us every day. That definition has created the mother of all marketplaces, one so ready to sell us products, services, even belief systems. all designed to instantly gratify every one of our needs and to eliminate any trace of those unhealthy emotions. Thank you. One, in fact, designed to have us believe that there is something inherently wrong in possessing imperfection at all. And we ourselves contribute to this in our media posts, our social media interaction, our lack of tolerance for each other, and most of all, in our lack of self-compassion. And every time that we are ashamed of our imperfections or we think they are something to be concealed or disguised, we contribute to a global society in which nobody's needs can ever be satisfied, in which none of us can ever have, do, or be enough. But we're the ones writing the dictionary, and we're the ones who can alter that definition of success. In Japanese culture, for centuries, they've mended broken ceramic bowls using a lacquer dusted in gold. It's believed that the imperfections make the piece more beautiful, more valuable, because they tell its story. This is part of a philosophy called wabi-sabi, a philosophy that nurtures all that is authentic by acknowledging three very simple realities. Nothing lasts, nothing finishes, and nothing is perfect. When I think back now to the Sahara, I don't think of what went wrong. I think of the tremendous peace I found every day at sunset. I think of the magnificence of the dawn every morning when I got up and had the privilege of walking another day in that magnificent place. And I think of endless nights spent around a campfire laughing with men like Muhammad, some of them wise, some of them not so wise. I think of endless nights spent in a swag, lying beneath an infinite carpet of stars and watching the heavens move above me, teaching me what it means to be insignificant. But what I think of most of all is that moment of profound clarity, moment of awareness, a gift I never would have had my needs not refused to be silenced and led me on a walk through every one of my own imperfections to a pot of gold I never knew existed. And if you take one thing from that pot of gold, it is that your imperfections are the most perfect thing about you. They are your greatest treasure, for they urge you to take the search your soul needs the most, the one to find your own missing pieces. And perhaps, if we can recognize and accept our own imperfections and those of others and those we see in the world around us, then we can create a new definition of success, one based on the understanding that genuine happiness, true power, and true fulfillment lie in an awareness that we are all just here. We are all perfect, and we are already enough.